name and a little background. I know you're an author. I know you are from upstate, but tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay, I'm Richard Williams from upstate New York. I am the author of the book entitled They Stole It, But You Must Return It, a book on the black family and black health. I worked as professor at the State University of New York for several years in the health science department. I worked as director of social service agency. I've traveled in 22 countries. I'm currently working as a consultant and doing workshops and seminars on the black family and black health.
This morning, you were speaking about the atrocities and the heinous crimes that were perpetrated on African people. Let's begin with where you began this morning and kind of give us an overview of the things that you touched on and talked on in this workshop here on black males.
Okay. What I did, I laid a foundation to show that the African family prior to the European invasion had a solid foundation, the members of the family had specific roles, and they were very respectful and guarded roles. The slavery experience was designed to destroy those roles, to challenge in the male his role as father and as man, and in the female her role as mother and woman. And when you tear away the fabric of the family, you attack the strongest foundation of a family. So I talked about the slavery experience as perhaps being the most devastating experience in the history of the world, where more than 40 million people were killed in the process, where families were deliberately sent to two different directions, where people were constantly branded, tortured, killed, and how certain reactions to the slavery experience have created behaviors that we carry on today. See, the slavery experience was so devastating that there were some reactions that took place, and those reactions, although they were survival reactions, became traditional behaviors, and those behaviors have been passed down, and it affects both blacks and whites today. And so I talked about how those experiences have affected us and what we must do to change it, how we as black folk must take into our own hands an agenda to rectify our dilemma.
What was it, slave experience? I want to speak in depth about that here. What was that process? You talked about on the ship, you talked about what happened to the African American male and female once they got here. Let's talk about that experience.
Okay, on the ship, for example, with the female, in order to change her concept about the sacredness of the sexual experience and her devotedness to her children, they would take small infants and throw them overboard, knowing that the mothers would go over after the children, and then they'd pull the mothers back and let the children go, pushing the concept that your offspring, where you're going, which was America, was not going to be under your control. When they got to the Caribbean, which was the breaking-in period, they would bring the new slaves out, bring a pregnant lady, tie her to a tree, strip her of her clothes, cut her open, pull the fetus out, once again reinforcing the concept that your body and your offspring does not really belong to you. And the black lady was exploited terribly sexually. She had, at one point, the census indicated that the slave mothers had more than, the average slave mother had more than 10 children. And in many cases, and in most cases, the female, the woman, did not have a choice of the mate that she slept with. This was under the auspices of the slave master. So her whole, and at one point it indicated that over 500,000 babies were mixed in 1 year, meaning the slave master and the slave master's friends also exploited her sexually. And so that had a devastating effect on the sacredness of the sexual experience that the African woman experienced prior to the European invasion. And the male, of course, was dehumanized. They were trying to confuse his role as father and as man. And they did this on a consistent basis, a constant basis. And his reaction to that experience has created habits that we have today, which are not really African and which are not really healthy. So we as black males are going to have to reassess those roles that are helpful to building strong black families and carrying on the roles of men.
I want to go back a moment to the breaking process. I guess that's what the slave master called it, the breaking process. You're saying that they would take a pregnant black woman as a psychological effect, tie her to a tree, cut her open, and take the fetus from her, and stomp it so that other slaves would see this and that fear would be impenetrated in their being.
The African warrior was a very strong person, and the atrocities that it took to break him then I had no idea until I researched the slavery experience what had happened. And I think that this is something that America has ignored, and it's something that we all ought to look at, because we'll understand how certain things and how we think today has come about. And I think that's probably necessary, because when you are trying to project a diagnosis, a solution, you need to look properly at the source in order to properly diagnose it, if you're looking for a solution. And I think the biggest problem in America is that we have ignored the slavery experience, especially blacks, and we need to look at that. We need to look at what we were and what we can be, and how the slavery experience has affected that, and how it is affecting that today, the concepts that have been passed down as a result of the slavery experience. But it was terrible. Nothing in the history of the world matches it. Nothing.
Let's talk about the breaking of the warrior. You talked about the warrior. What was the warrior like, and what happened to him?
Well, the male was, he was a nurturer. He was the protector of his family. He was an educator. His responsibility was to make sure that his son learned those kinds of behaviors that were necessary for him to be a man and a father. He took on special attention to that. He had a respect for that role. That role was taken away from him. Matter of fact, the male had the whole choice of African Americans choosing who they were to marry was actually taken away from them. And that was also very important to the African, for the family themselves to have a part in choosing who the mate was. The whole American process just ripped that whole process apart. And so the experiences that our foreparents had here in America was quite different than what they had been accustomed to. And that has left a devastating effect on our psyche. And we must look at that, and we must change. We must go back to those strengths.
What were some of the atrocities used to break the warrior, to destroy him?
Well, they would, in the Caribbean, which was the breaking-in period, many times they would kill 2 or 3 for no reason, just to set up a tone. They had what they call the windmill, and the windmill it had razor blades in the plates. It would go around, and they would bring the African women over. They didn't have to do anything. It wasn't a punishment, and would hang them from by their hands with their legs folded under. And when they would get tired, they'd let their legs go down and they would cut their feet. Just breaking them in had nothing to do with a reaction to a negative behavior, but that was part of the breaking in period. If a slave was determined, if they determined that they were going to hang a slave, many times they would castrate him before they hung him and place the penis in his mouth, and then let him hang there and let all the slaves see it. And there were situations in which a male who was associated with the family did a behavior or committed something that the white man didn't like. They would cut his head off and his family's head, and they would place him on the fence to have, so slaves could see it and be constantly reminded that any kind of deviation from what the slave masters wanted, this could be your fate. And this is what our children grew up seeing. This is what our foreparents as children grew up seeing day in and day out. So they were constantly under a threat of abuse, like I said, which is unmatched in the history of the world.
What did this do to the psyche of the black man, woman, child, family, people?
Well, like I said in the talk, there's a concept called psychosomatic. And that concept is when the trauma is too great for the conscious mind to deal with, the subconscious mind will deal with it to make the being feel a little more comfortable. And so there had to be some reactions, because if black folk had consciously looked at all of these atrocities, they all would have gone crazy. So they learned ways in which to deny, ways in which to ignore, or ways in which to feel good about themselves in a negative situation. And black folk manifest that today. We will take a negative situation, and we will support that negative situation. We will take a negative concept and we will support a negative concept. An example is the word nigger, for example, which was a white man's word, name, thrust on us as black folk. In order for us to feel more comfortable with that word, we grab that word and we start using the word for ourselves, and we use it quite often to describe ourselves in a negative and a positive way. We even throw affectionate concepts along with that word, like women refer to their sweetheart as, well, that's my nigger. And so we learn how to take these untasteful experiences and make them palatable to us by somehow reinterpreting them. That was fine for the slave because he was in a survival situation. But for us to continue on to do that today and to continue those slave concepts is detrimental to us, and we must make a change. We must do it very soon.
How much of this have carried over into black male-female relationships today? I mean, as Shahrazan Ali just wrote this book, The Black Man's Guide to Understanding the Black Woman. It seems to be a tremendous amount of tension between black males, black females, understanding our roles, getting along with each other. But it is my belief that underneath all of that is a slave experience, very similar to a marriage in which one party or both parties have committed adultery against the other party. They want to be together, so they don't talk about it. So up underneath that relationship, they can't be whole in the way they were when they first got married, because they have in their psyche that you have cheated, which is that whole exposure of black women to the white slave master at his will, and we haven't talked about it. What damage has that done to our psyche? How does that play out in our relationship?
Yeah, well, I think it plays a negative, a very negative situation for us. Even though during slavery the black woman had more latitude to develop her children, and she had more latitude to pull the strength of her family together, she has resented that in the black male. She has not understood, I don't think, that the black male's containment is part of America's way for the black man. And so there is some resentment. It's sort of paradoxical, because the black male is discouraged when he tries to do things on his own. She feels more comfortable if he works for the white structure. She would rather have her husband go and work for the white structure than for him to try to go out and do a business, because she really doesn't have confidence in him as a man. And that's the sad part, because black women don't have confidence in us, and they try to discourage the kinds of entrepreneurship that black men are capable of doing and should be doing, and in those kinds of situations they need the support. But that is not a deliberate or conscious thing on the part of black women and black men. It's just that tradition reinforces that. The black woman also creates a problem for the black male in that she teaches her son the kinds of, and encourages the kinds of behaviors that's going to make him eventually an adult that she can't stand. And the kind of, well, at least the kind of characteristics she can't stand in her husband. So we're going to have to look at the way in which we look at each other. We also have to look in the way in which we communicate with each other. Black folk during slavery learned not to express hurt. And this is why, black men are never hurt. No matter what the situation is, he'll always tell you why it was cool for him to do what he did, And if you watch black men and black women, when they have a problem between each other, they usually try to express that you don't hurt me, Hey, I had it before you got here. Or you're just a rabbit around here looking for a squirrel. And we learn how to, in very ritualistic ways, tell each other that we don't need each other, we don't hurt each other, you can't hurt me, which is not true. I've counseled many couples, and I find the reason why they pull away has nothing to do with their love for each other. It has something to do with the way they communicate. One wants to say you can't hurt me, and the other one wants to come back with a reaction saying you can't hurt me either. And so I think we need to learn how to really communicate and express how we feel, and that's a very difficult thing for black folk, because black folk usually don't. I'll give you an example of a scenario that could have happened on a plantation, and this will let you can associate this with things that go on today. If the slave master was to take two black guys into the shed to beat them, and he was going to give one of them 15 licks, and the other one, if he was to give 10 licks. Now, the guy that he gives 10 licks, when he comes out of the shed and he comes with his peers, he's going to say something like, man, hey, I ain't going to let the cat hit me but more than 10 times. See, right away. See, he didn't say nothing about the licks, but he's talking about how bad he is. I ain't letting the cat hit me more than 10 times. Now, the guy that comes out with the 15 licks, he's going to say something like this. Shucks, man, I could have taken 30, brother. Hey, that ain't nothing. So in all situations, even though they're negative, we learn how to say, you can't hurt me, and that's the first thing that happens in a relationship, and those kinds of behaviors, we're going to have to reassess and change, because we are for each other as black men and black women, and we need to throw off those shackles that are holding us apart. And I would like to see us do some, I like the book that you named, I understand it's an excellent book, but I haven't seen what she had to say in it. But I understand that I'm glad to know that people are looking at the relationship now between black men and black women from an Afrocentric perspective, based on the problems of the slavery experience. So that's encouraging.
I, for some reason, can't get the slave experience out of my heart, out of my mind. I'm one of those people who think about it almost day and night. Maybe because I still feel it and I was born in the South, and so I saw a lot of it as a child coming up. And I know our young people are just not familiar with that experience. But some of those things that happen to us, again, I want to go back to that breaking process. There. What was, let's talk about it more. I think we need to chronicle it as much as we possibly can, so people will begin to look at what we have been through and realize that we are really some of the strongest men and women on the face of the earth via the very process that was designed to destroy us as human beings.
Well, with the male, like I said, there's a God-given right for a male to be a man and a father. That's your God-given right, with your choices in that matter. That was taken away from the male. He was humiliated as a man in that he was beaten, called boy, even by small white boys, kids. He was actually called boy. He had to respond to white children as if they were above or at least as equal. When a father had a child, when he fathered a child, when the male fathered a child, he had no authority over that child. Only the authority that the slave master allowed. If the slave master wanted to sell the child, beat the child, sell the child, or even kill the child, the father had limited authority over that. Without, I mean, he could do something, but he'd take his own life in jeopardy. It was the slave master that actually owned that child. That in itself is the height of insult. It's the height of humiliation for someone to take your own flesh and blood by a God-given mandate to take that away from you and to humiliate you. So black folk could not deal with the humiliation, so they chose other ways in which to deal with it. So they ignored it. So the males became distant from the obligation of his family. Sure, he would drop the seed, but as far as the obligation and some other things, he would deal with that in a different way, because there was no other choice for him. The choices were limited. That has had a devastating effect on us, because those things were passed down. Those things were part of our traditional experience here in America. And you don't change. Tradition is a hard thing to change. There usually has to be a reason, first of all, to change. And people have not brought up the reason because we have ignored the slave experience. So you said the slave experience is on your mind every day. I think it should be on everybody's mind every day, because I think that policies are developed as a result of that. Like I was mentioning in the office there. I mean, the Jim Crow laws that lasted 100 years were developed because of the slavery experience, the effect of the slavery experience. Right here in New York State today, right here today, you and I as a black man cannot go down and adopt a white child, but a white person can go down and adopt a black child. And there are a lot of things like this that are very much a part of us. And we as black folk, we've learned to ignore those things, because to focus on them are hurting. But I think we got to focus on them. I think we are human beings. We are total human beings, and we need to make sure that people respond to us as total human beings.
Some of our young people who may be viewing this program and may not understand the valiantry and the gallantry of African men, the bravery of African men, may say, well, but didn't they try to fight? I mean, how is it that they allowed this to happen to so many millions and millions and millions of Africans when there were more Africans than Europeans? So I think we need to get a perspective of a war that went on.
Well, what happened was, we have to also realize this, that the Industrial Revolution took place in Europe. And France exchanged ideas with England, and England exchanged ideas with Germany. And that whole process, they were exchanging ideas. Africa was left out at that part of the process. And so they came down to exploit Africa. And so they were able to use some of that technology against us.
We're talking about the Gatling gun and the gun specifically in terms of warfare.
Yeah. And so Africa fought. I mean, there like I said, even here in the States, there is evidence of at least 300 major, I'm not talking about just uprisings, major uprisings. There's also evidence that the federal government helped put down some of these uprisings. So there was a fight. But when you see killings day in and day out, and when you know that if you fight, your family and your friends are going to be beheaded as a result of your fighting, after a while you try to assess it. Even though you want to do it, you try to assess it. And so having other folk involved, children and mothers involved, along with the other uprisings, along with over 50 million people killed, the male eventually began to to take a different posture. And the second generation mothers helped that because she did not want her son killed. She had seen all of this, and so she tried to discourage any kind of innovation on the part of her son to challenge the system because she didn't want to see him killed. And so we began to accept not fighting in certain situations. And but we know that even today that we are capable of fighting. It's just a matter of concept change to direct that energy. So we still are fighters, but it's just that we have learned to fight against ourselves, and we have learned not to use our fighting to protect our family, which was taken away from us a long time ago. We need to throw that energy about protecting our family, protecting our communities, protecting our interest, protecting ourselves, and we need to once again reinstate that.
I'm going to ask you 3 questions that are related. Most people do not conceive, most black people do not conceive themselves as being still in slavery. So I'm going to ask you, number 1, are we still enslaved? And number 2, if we are enslaved, why don't we perceive that ourselves as being enslaved? And if we are enslaved and do not perceive ourselves as being enslaved, will we ever truly be liberated?
Okay, number 1, we are still enslaved. The concepts, like I said, that were developed to enslave are very much a part of the behavior in both white and black America. That's why, in many cases, it seems like there's a double system, double justice and double everything else, simply because during slavery they just had 2 sets of laws to deal with those who had come here for free and those who had come here on the ship. But if you don't look at slavery, you assume that your plight and your behaviors are okay. This is one of the reasons why black folk are willing to accept the status that they're in, because they think that this is the way it ought to be. They don't evaluate this as a I call it in my book, I call it a refining process, and they do this all the time. I'm a nutritionist, so I know about this. If you take wheat or you take grain, you take the nutrients out of it, all of the nutrients out of it. You go through a refining and a milling process, and you take all the nutrients out of it. And then you put it, say if this particular grain had 21 nutrients in it, and you put back 8 of them, you call it refined. In other words, you took all the 21 original out, and then you put 8, you add 8, and you say refined. And we call it refined bread, which is white bread, which is not as nutritious as the original whole wheat bread. And so that's what we are functioning on as African Americans. We're functioning on the refined process, where they took away our culture, they took away all our history, they took away everything that we came over here with, and then gave us a watered down version of Africa and tried to give us the European system, and that was a whole refinement. And so we call ourselves refined, but just like refined bread, which is inferior to whole wheat, refined African Americans. And they don't like it when I say it, but we are refined African Americans. And we need to put all of those nutrients back that we had before. You know, yes, white bread is palatable to a lot of people because it doesn't have the body, and some people like it because that's all they're used to. But it's not nutritious as the original bread. And so we need to get back to that real bread.
Can we win? Can we truly liberate ourselves? I mean,
we have to.
We're in a country and in a system that controls the ultimate means of destruction. Therefore, it controls all lesser means of destruction. In your spiritual eye, and this is our final question. I want to end on this upbeat note. But in your spiritual eye, what do you say to our brothers and sisters who are conscious and believe that they're in a no-win situation?
Well, I think that we must, in order to win, we must come together as a people. We must like each other. We must work together. We must have an African-American agenda. We must. From the man on the street to the president of the Black Congressional Caucus, to all agencies that say that they are their constituency is black, they have got to have a black agenda. We've got to do that. If we are able to pull ourselves together as a group, as other groups that were in this kind of dilemma, we can do it. But if we continue to look to the American European system to bring us out of this dilemma, then we're setting ourselves up to only perpetuate the plantation relationship, even though it may be a little more sophisticated. But sophistication does not necessarily mean progress. The slave in the field, once he was moved to the house, may have had better food, but he was still a slave. See, and so we have confused liberation with conveniences. But I think in order for us to truly be liberated, we ourselves are going to have to look in the strengths of black folk, have to come together and do it. And I think it's going to happen. I think it has to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, and to the young people particularly who have who didn't see racism in its true color, but who may think that it doesn't exist, I think they're going to have to also take a look at the slavery experience, take a look at blacks here in America, take a look at white America, take a look at the relationship, take a look at racism, and understand that if this is going to be a good country, a growing country, then Americans are going to have to look eyeball to eyeball, and blacks are going to have to whites and blacks are going to have to look eyeball to eyeball. And we have never had that kind of relationship in the United States. It's always been a whites looking down and blacks looking up. That's not a healthy relationship. And as a matter of fact, to show, and I'll close with this, to show why that's not a healthful relationship, when you bring two factors together that are not equal, or factors that don't perceive themselves as being equal, you get a mess. That's why integration has caused us to lose a lot of black businesses, and also the dropout rate among blacks have increased in schools since we've had integration. You see, so once again, the conveniences, we're looking at conveniences rather than product, rather than really being truly liberated. So I believe that unless we pull ourselves aside as black folk, it'll never happen. But I'm hoping that it will happen. So I'm saying, black folk, please, let's come together.
What's the alternative? I mean, can you foresee genocide on black people?
I think history repeats itself unless there is something that's aggressive, that opposes the regular trend. Right after slavery, we thought that America was willing to open up for blacks. 20 years after slavery, they had Jim Crow laws that set blacks back to a slavery concept almost. We had Jim Crow laws, and that lasted for 100 years. The 60s, 100 years later, an exact 100 years later, we had the uprisings of the 60s. And once again, we thought that now white America and America is opening up to blacks. But now we see racism sticking its ugly head up again, and I think it's about to strike. And I think that unless black folks, see, the problem we made before is that we didn't have a black agenda right after slavery. We depended on America to do the right thing, but America did not do the right thing. And I think we are still depending on America to do the right thing. America's not going to do the right thing. We must make sure that the right thing is done. And we must focus on ourselves and the development and the building of ourselves. And if we don't, I can see very easily something similar to the Jim Crow laws happening here in America. Because after all, this is the same America who at the time of slavery epitomized freedom and also Christianity. And yet they were able to come up with that terrible system. In both areas, now the morale and a lot of other things have gotten worse than then. So the potential of something happening now is greater than it was then. So I think we definitely got to wake up.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Make sure I get your card so we can